Hello, I'm Benjamin Montoya. Thank you for checking into our panel. Today I'll be presenting on a moment in the late 1920s when a Mexican delegation to an international conference took that multilateral setting to protest U.S. immigration law. First of all, what my presentation is contributing to is this larger panel that wants to contextualize the issue of immigration restriction and U.S.-Mexican relations. When the participants and I put together this roundtable, we were really interested in how different episodes from the past 100 years or so could really give a broad, again, pretext perhaps, to the current debate over a wall between the United States and Mexico. And so this is what you're going to hear about. Again, thank you for checking into this round table. And we're very interested, Dr. Goodman, Dr. Gutierrez, and Dr. Overmeyer Velasquez are very interested in your comments. So please feel free to share them. So let me go ahead and bring up my PowerPoint here. All right, here we go. There we go. Okay. The issue at stake. First, again, as I just mentioned, in the late 1920s, Mexico is taking it upon itself to protest a U.S. immigration restriction effort. This is to get us right into the problem of what was going on during these years. If you study immigration history, you know that in the mid-1920s, you see some sizable changes to U.S. immigration law that really start in 1917 with the Literacy Act, but really culminate in 1924 with a quota. We know that the quota applies to European immigration. By those same laws, Asian immigration is completely restricted. By contrast, immigration from the Western Hemisphere is not restricted. And so in tandem with troubles related to the Mexican Revolution, but also because of the fact that you have this void of a diminishing amount of immigrants coming to the United States after the mid-1920s, more and more Mexican immigrants are coming in. Many of those same congressional leaders who in the early 1920s would eventually push through the National Origins Act, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, they would pressure for placing a quota on Mexican immigration. And that's not really what I'm going to dive into per se. That's kind of really the touching point of what the conflict I'll get to today. So this is the problem of the United States in the late 1920s trying to place a quota on Mexico. And during 1928, you would see congressional hearings would be taking place. And my larger work really considers how this effort in the late 1920s by the United States really affects U.S.-Mexican relations. And ultimately, what I argue is that this quota effort fails in large part because of the diplomatic ramifications of such a proposal. So what I'm presenting on today is just a small tidbit, if you will, of that larger conversation. As hearings are taking place in Washington, D.C., two international conferences are held in Havana, Cuba. The first, the Sixth Pan-American Meeting, as you see right here, mid-January to mid-February 1928. Among the many things that delegates to the Pan-American Conference discuss is this issue, this growing international concern over immigration. And what's interesting about not just this conference, but especially the second one that I'll highlight is as immigration starts to become more of an internationally discussed topic, the United States becomes more and more rapidly focused on formulating immigration policy strictly in a domestic sense. In other words, not really considering the interests of the nations affected by its immigration policy, whether those are the European nations placed under the quota, or in this case, Mexico and the implications of a quota placed on its immigration. So among the many things that the Pan-American Meeting deliberates on, one of those things is immigration. And they produce a statement of principles. I'll just share a very small bit that is relevant for us here. The immigrant must enjoy the same rights and legal guarantees of the country to which the immigrant has entered, with the exception to the political rights distinct to the nation. Host nations may never, and this is the key part, host nations may never pronounce measures of any nature that tend to place the immigrant in a legal situation or in fact inferior position to that of nationals. In other words, and hopefully this stands out to you right away, what Pan-American delegates are arguing in the early part of 1928 is immigrants should not be placed in an inferior position legally to nationals, to citizens of that host country. There's a context to this, right? There's a context to everything. There's a pretext, if you will. What delegates to this conference in 1928 are building upon are two legal doctrines that for many years were largely just discussed in academic circles. But we'll see, touching on to some of the things I've already mentioned, the Mexican Revolution most notably, these doctrines will become more and more fundamental and foundational to a challenge against U.S. immigration policy. So let's talk about these in train here. First, Carlos Calvo, who was an Argentine diplomat and scholar. Between the late 1860s and early and mid-1890s, he develops what becomes known collectively as the Calvo Clause. And what he's fundamentally concerned with is foreign nations' right to intervene in other nations' affairs. Not just this, but he's concerned with promoting this idea of equality between nations. And what he's fundamentally concerned with is this right of extraterritorial rights. And he argues that foreign citizens that own property in a state should not enjoy extraterritorial protections. In other words, the home countries of those foreign nationals that are owning property in a country should not expect themselves to be protected if their property gets seized by the host country of their property. For Mexican leaders, and I'll talk more about this when I get to the Mexican Revolution, but the Calvo Clause would strike a chord, especially for Mexican leaders. If you know anything about Mexican history, you know that from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, more and more Mexican property is being absorbed by Europeans and especially Americans. Many of those foreign property owners, whether they're in coffee, in oil, in precious metals, things like this, many of them would seek protections to damages to their property from their home governments, whether those governments were based in London, Paris, or Washington, D.C. So here's Carlos Calvo basically saying, look, if you, as a foreigner, if you are an American who is buying mining property in Mexico, for example, you should not expect that if anything happens to that property, that the United States will come to your assistance. This is the risk that you take. Because what he's basically arguing is foreigners are enjoying more legal protections than the actual citizens living in that country. Let me just give a couple of quotes here that highlight this better. America, as well as Europe, is inhabited today by free and independent nations whose sovereign existence has the right to the same respect. You'll notice how he's building up this idea of equality. Aliens who establish themselves in a country have the same right to protection as nationals. Again, his primary concern is arguing against extraterritorial rights, but what he's basing this argument on is inequality of nations, inequality between nations, right? So just like inequality in this case between the United States and Mexico, even though there might be massive power disparities, a major asymmetry between their economic, political, and military abilities, nevertheless, all nations are equal. Another Argentine, just a few years later, takes up this argument further. Luis Drago, writing at the time and actually writing in response to the Venezuelan debt crisis of 1902 and 1903, again, one of these moments where you see various European nations and the Americans threatening to intervene into Venezuela for the sake of collecting on debts. Drago is directly, building off of Calvo's doctrine. The main thing he's arguing is equality of nations. And what he's saying is no foreign nation has the right to intervene in another state's affairs for the purpose of collecting debts. He says what this does is fundamentally destabilizes the debtor nation, and it violates, taking us back to the equality of nations, it violates this sacrosanct idea that all nations are equal. Let me give you a quote here that highlights this. All states, whatever be the force at their disposal, are entities in law, perfectly equal to one another, and mutually entitled by virtue thereof to the same consideration and respect. Now, again, the context has nothing to do with Mexico directly, has nothing, the Mexican Revolution is nowhere near happening quite just yet. What he's arguing fundamentally is this idea that nations are equal, regardless of his main point here. All states, whatever be the force at their disposal. In other words, regardless of how powerful or not powerful they are, all nations are equal. As I've already highlighted, these two modes of thinking, these two legal arguments, were largely academic. I mean, most European and American thinkers totally rejected them out of hand. One thing I do want you to take away, though, before we move on to the point I have here, is nevertheless what they do represent is this Latin American challenge, this Latin American challenge to to an Anglo-American view of how political capitalist systems should be maintained, right? Theodore Roosevelt, for example, who was president at the time that Luis Drago, president of the United States, at the time that Luis Drago released this doctrine, as we all know, students of diplomatic history, he was more than comfortable with using U.S. military might to collect on debts. He believed that it was his right to do so. So again, we have to remember the context in which Drago is writing that doctrine. It's really during the Mexican Revolution, at least in the period that we're focused on here, it's really during the Mexican Revolution that you see these largely academic legal doctrines start to go through a revolutionary filter, if you will, and take on a new life all their own. I don't have anywhere near the time to go into the Mexican Revolution. Suffice to say, it starts in 1910. By 1915, the fantastically bearded Venustiano Carranza, pictured right here, comes to power in Mexico. He'll be president of Mexico for the next 5 years. During those 5 years, you'll see really kind of the gradual winding down of the military violent phase of the Mexican Revolution. A new constitution will be promulgated in 1917. And during that same year, Carranza will produce his own doctrine, really building off of the Drago and Calvo doctrines. And let me just give you a small snapshot of how this is, and what I want you to pay attention to is how he is using this doctrine to push back against U.S. power, but it's also to talk about equality among nations. Four main things. The Carranza doctrine argued for judicial equality among all nations, among all American states. It denounced the Monroe Doctrine as constituting interferences into the domestic affairs of Latin American countries. The doctrine hoped to establish a relationship of true solidarity among Latin American nations based on the principle of non-intervention. Right? It called for treaties and alliances between Latin American nations and any other countries that aligned with their interests. So you're seeing a couple things are going on here. Equality among nations, solidarity among Latin American nations, a protest against the Monroe Doctrine. This is the context underlying some of the activities that you will see at the Second International Conference on Immigration and Immigration, in which you see, again, the immediate concern at the time is the United States trying to place a quota on Mexican immigration. Probably just for a few seconds at least, give an idea of why the United States is trying to do this, for reasons that probably aren't hard to imagine and have striking similarities to today. For many U.S. leaders, Mexican immigrants were undesirable, to put it kindly. They might use much more colorful and disgusting language, such as they were criminals. They were prone to laziness. They were not the good stuff of American citizens. And so therefore, just like Italians and Russians and Jews were argued against to be excluded, quota advocates of the late 1920s in the United States said, we need to block Mexican immigration. So this is underlying all of this, right? This idea that not only are you arguing for the equality of nations, but you're arguing for the equality of citizens, of people, taking us back to the title of this presentation, as I have reiterated right here, the quality of free man. The second International Conference on Immigration and Immigration considers a set of proposals passed down from the Sixth Pan American Conference. It calls for the quality of man to be recognized in each immigrant, and that there should be equal protection of rights and human dignity towards all immigrants. And this is a key part, the protection of which can justify any limitation on a nation's sovereignty. So you can already see how we're now in the late 1920s. Delegates to that first conference, the Sixth Pan American Conference, are building off of the Drago and Calvo doctrines. They're saying not only are nations equal, but the citizens among those nations are equal. So if an Argentine goes to the United States, that Argentine immigrant shouldn't be considered legally inferior to an American citizen just because that Argentine is an immigrant, right? They are all equal in legal terms as, for lack of a better phrase, global citizens. The Mexican delegation takes this argument even farther at the same conference. In about mid-April 1928, towards the last week of this conference, they not only build off of this idea of equality among nations, not only do they filter it through this revolutionary lens of Mexican nationals should be protected by their revolutionary state, but they make this statement, and this is directly against the quota efforts at this same time taking place in Washington, D.C. None of the American nations can place obstacles on the immigration and emigration of other nations or limit it to a determined number of citizens. Let me just read that again. None of the American nations, Western Hemisphere nations, can place obstacles on the immigration and emigration of other nations or limit, in other words, a quota, or limit it to a determined number of citizens. Revolutionary Mexican leaders are making a bold statement here. They're taking for granted that nations are equal with each other. But they're also saying, and this takes us back to that previous quote on the quality of free man, that a nation's sovereignty should be limited for the sake of protecting equal rights among global citizens. Why is this relevant for us? When I put these comments together, I was thinking about how what this represents is a reinvigorated Mexican nationalism. For Mexican leaders in the late 1920s, early 1930s, their main argument against the quota was, that this represents a slight to U.S.-Mexican relations. It flies in the face of any kind of bilateral or multilateral cooperation for real immigration reform. And if you take on that lesson and apply it to the present, when you talk about things like the wall, for Mexican leaders, it's not just a disgrace. I mean, a similarity to the late 1920s, not just the public rhetoric and a way that it represents Mexican immigrants in U.S. society, referring to them as criminals and rapists and things like this. But the very representation, the very symbol of a wall seems to fly in the face of U.S.-Mexican diplomatic relations and seems to create this implicit inferiority of Mexican immigrants. And for those of us who are focused on not only kind of the tactile aspects of immigration policy and reform, but also the kind of more amorphous ways in which immigrants are represented in U.S. society, we can get a sense of what Mexican leaders and Latin American leaders were arguing in the late 1920s was quite significant. This idea that not only should sovereignty rights of a nation not necessarily be undermined, but they should be balanced between diplomatic harmony and the realities of immigration. But citizens of one nation to another should be considered equal to each other, or at least not considered legally inferior. And I think not only was that relevant in the late 1920s, especially when we get to the early 1930s, when we'll see hundreds of thousands of Mexicans kicked out of the United States, boy, is that relevant now when we talk about deportation taking place as we speak of hundreds of thousands of Mexican citizens and Central American citizens. So I look forward to your comments, and I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you very much.